Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking up before the sun rises. Not in a warm bed, not to the smell of breakfast or the sound of a family laughing. You wake up on a dirt floor, inside a wooden shack barely large enough to hold 5 people, and there are 12 of you inside. Your body aches from the day before, and the day before that, and every single day stretching back as far as memory goes. You are not a guest here. You are not an employee. You are property. Your name is written in a ledger, somewhere alongside the price paid for you, and the man who owns that ledger owns you too. The sun has not yet risen, but the bell will ring soon. And when it rings, you must be in the field. This is not a horror story. This is history. This is real. And it happened to millions of human beings across more than 2 centuries on American soil alone. Today, we are going inside that world, not to sanitize it, not to look away, but to truly understand what daily life looked like, felt like, smelled like, and meant for the people who lived it and died inside it. Because they deserve to be remembered not as footnotes, but as full human beings whose stories shaped everything that came after them. The 18th century plantation system was one of the most sophisticated machines of human exploitation ever constructed. It looked, from the outside, almost peaceful. Wide green fields stretching to the horizon. White columned manor houses sitting at the ends of long oak-lined paths. Immaculate gardens. Well-dressed men on horseback. The kind of landscape that would later be romanticized in paintings and novels. But behind that portrait was a violence so systemic, so calculated, so embedded in law and custom and economy, that it required the deliberate destruction of a person's sense of self just to keep it running. And the people tasked with running it had developed, over generations, very efficient tools for doing exactly that. To understand life on an 18th century plantation, you first have to understand the geography of terror. A large plantation in the American South during the 1700s might cover several thousand acres. Cotton in the lower South, tobacco in Virginia and the Carolinas, rice and indigo along the Georgia and South Carolina coast, sugar further south, and the Korean Islands, where conditions were so brutal that death rates among enslaved people regularly outpaced births. At the center of all of this was the great house, the residence of the planter and his family. Radiating out from it like spokes on a wheel were the quarters, the fields, the barns, the kitchens, the smokehouses, the stables. Every inch of that geography was designed with one purpose in mind: maximum extraction of labor at minimum cost. And the raw material was human life. The enslaved population on a mid-sized plantation might number anywhere from 30 to over 100 people, depending on the crop and the wealth of the owner. They were organized, managed, and monitored with a precision that would not look out of place in a modern corporate structure. There were drivers, enslaved men appointed by the master to oversee work in the fields, often given a whip and the terrible burden of choosing between their own safety and the suffering of those around them. There were overseers, usually poor white men hired to manage the day-to-day operations of the fields. And above them all was the planter himself, a man whose entire identity, social standing, and economic survival depended on the continued subjugation of the people he owned. The day began before dawn. That is not a metaphor. Enslaved workers were expected to be in the fields when the sky was still dark, and the system of punishment for being late was swift, public, and designed to leave a lasting impression. A bell or a horn would sound across the quarters, and within minutes, children as young as 8 years old were stumbling through the dark toward rows of tobacco plants or cotton bolls. Old people whose bodies had been broken by decades of this same work moved beside them. Pregnant women moved beside them. People who had been beaten the day before moved beside them. There was no medical leave. There was no compassionate exception. There was the field, and there was punishment, and there was nothing in between. Work in a tobacco field was relentless and precise. Each plant had to be carefully monitored through its entire growth cycle. The leaves examined for worms by hand, the suckers removed so that the plant's energy went into the leaves that would eventually be cured and sold. The work demanded not brute strength, but sustained attention. Hour after hour, under a Virginia sun that could push temperatures above 100 degrees in the summer months. Enslaved workers received no water breaks by right. They received no shade by right. What they received was a quota, and if the quota was not met, the consequences were physical. Cotton was different in its brutality. The cotton plant looks almost delicate from a distance, its white boll soft and clean against the deep green leaves. Up close, the reality was different. The bolls had sharp, dry edges that sliced through fingers with each pick. By the end of a day in the cotton fields, hands were bleeding. By the end of a season, the skin had toughened into something barely recognizable. Picking cotton was paid by the pound, which meant that the faster you worked, the more you were expected to produce the next day, because your overseer now knew your capacity and would hold you to it. There was no benefit to being skilled. There was no reward for working harder. There was only the ever-rising baseline of what was expected of you, and the punishment that waited when you fell short. Sugar was the most savage of all. In the Caribbean and Louisiana, where the climate could sustain sugar cultivation, enslaved workers operated under conditions so extreme that historians have compared the plantations to death camps in the regularity of their mortality rates. Sugar had to be cut with machetes in tropical heat, and it had to be processed quickly, began to ferment. During grinding season, the mills ran 24 hours a day, and so did the enslaved workers, in rotating shifts that could last 18 hours or longer. Accidents in the grinding machinery were common and catastrophic. Exhaustion-related deaths were considered a predictable cost of doing business. On some Caribbean islands in the early 18th century, the average life expectancy of an enslaved person after arrival was 7 years. The quarters, where enslaved people slept, were not homes in any meaningful sense of the word. They were functional structures designed to house as many people as possible at as little expense as possible. A typical cabin might measure 16 feet by 18 feet, with a dirt floor, a single fireplace for both heating and cooking, gaps in the wooden walls that let in winter wind, and a sleeping loft so low that an adult could not stand upright inside it. Families were housed together when it was convenient for the master to allow it, and separated when it was convenient for him to sell. A man might come home from the field one evening to find that his wife had been sold to a planter 2 counties over that morning while he was working. He would never see her again. This happened regularly enough that it was not considered unusual. Clothing was issued by the master twice a year, usually at Christmas and in the summer. It was rough, cheap, and wholly inadequate for the climate. In winter, enslaved people in Virginia and the Carolinas often had no coats, no socks, and shoes made of untreated leather that cracked and froze. Children frequently went barefoot year-round. Medical care was almost non-existent, not out of ignorance, but out of economics. A doctor's visit cost money, and unless an enslaved person represented a significant financial investment, their illness was likely to be treated with whatever folk remedies circulated through the quarters, or not treated at all. Dysentery, malaria, typhoid fever, pneumonia, and infected wounds from labor injuries and punishment were common causes of death. Infant mortality rates in the enslaved population were staggeringly high. Food was rationed. A typical weekly allotment for an enslaved adult in the 18th century might include a peck of cornmeal and 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork or salt fish. No vegetables were included in this ration. No fruit, no variety. The diet was calibrated to provide enough calories to sustain physical labor and nothing more. Many enslaved people supplemented this ration by keeping small gardens in whatever light was available after their work was done, by fishing in rivers and streams on Sundays if allowed, by raising chickens if they could manage it. But these supplements existed at the pleasure of the master, and they could be taken away without warning or explanation. What the ration system never accounted for was the human need for flavor, memory, and culture. And this is where something extraordinary began to happen in the quarters. Something the plantation system had not planned for and could not fully destroy. Enslaved people from West Africa and Central Africa brought with them a profound and sophisticated culinary tradition. And even within the brutal constraints of slavery, they adapted it. The okra that made its way into the American South came from West Africa. The technique of slow cooking tough cuts of meat into something rich and sustaining came from African tradition. The rice cultivation that made South Carolina planters wealthy was itself a technology transferred from Africans who had grown rice for generations before they were enslaved. The food culture of the American South is, at its root, an African achievement created under conditions of extreme deprivation by people whose names history largely failed to record. Inside the quarters, after the working day was done, and if the overseer had moved on, something else came alive. Music was one of the few forms of expression that could not be entirely prohibited, though many masters tried. Drumming was banned on most large plantations because planters feared it could be used to communicate or coordinate rebellion. But singing could not be stopped. What emerged from those evening gatherings was one of the most significant musical traditions in human history. The spirituals sung in the quarters during the 18th century were not simply religious devotion, though they were that too. They were coded language. They were emotional survival. They were a declaration, quiet and unbreakable, that the people singing them were still people, that they had inner lives that no sale or punishment could reach. The spiritual tradition that would eventually give birth to gospel, the blues, jazz, soul, rock and roll, and virtually every major American musical form of the 20th century was born in those wooden shacks on ground soaked in suffering. When you listen to music today, in almost any genre that grew from American soil, you are hearing the echo of something that survived conditions that were designed to silence it. That should stop you. It should make you sit with the weight of what was created and what it cost to create it. Religion itself was a contested territory on the plantation. Many planters were initially resistant to allowing their enslaved workers to convert to Christianity, fearing that baptism might have legal implications for their status as property. As the 18th century progressed, and it became clear that Christian baptism would not legally threaten the institution of slavery, some planters began to encourage it, primarily because certain interpretations of Christian teaching could be used as a tool of control. Enslaved people were preached to from carefully selected biblical passages about obedience to masters, about patience in suffering, about rewards waiting in heaven. This was Christianity as sedative, as instrument of submission. But enslaved people did not receive it that way. In the privacy of the quarters, in worship meetings held in secret in the woods and swamps and hollow places, away from the eyes of overseers, a very different Christianity took shape. It was a Christianity of Moses, not Paul, of liberation, not submission, of the God who saw suffering and eventually brought judgment upon those who caused it. The Exodus story resonated with a power that the planters had not anticipated when they began allowing their enslaved population to hear the Bible, and it would keep resonating quietly but insistently through generation after generation until it became one of the philosophical foundations of the abolitionist movement and eventually the civil rights movement. The lives of enslaved children deserve particular attention because their experience contained a cruelty that is easy to overlook in the broader accounting of plantation horror. A child born into slavery was, from the moment of their birth, the property of the master. They were noted in the ledger. They were given a value. Until they were old enough to work in the fields, children might be assigned to mind younger children, to carry water, to sweep, to serve in the great house, to be what was called a companion for the master's children, which meant something far more complicated and psychologically damaging than simple friendship. An enslaved child who played with a planter's child was still enslaved. They were still available to be sold. The friendship could be ended at any moment by a decision made in the great house. The education of enslaved children was forbidden by law in most of the American South by the mid-18th century. This was not accidental. Literacy was understood to be dangerous, and with good reason. People who could read their own deeds of sale. They could read maps. They could read newspapers. They could write passes allowing themselves to move through the countryside without an overseer. In 1740, after the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, in which a group of enslaved Africans rose up and killed dozens of white colonists, before being suppressed with extraordinary violence, the southern colonies began tightening their restrictions on enslaved people with renewed fear. Literacy, religious gathering, movement, drumming, and assembly were all restricted or prohibited entirely. The system was not merely economic, it was cultural annihilation. And yet literacy survived in the quarters, passed quietly from person to person at tremendous personal risk. There are documented accounts of enslaved people who taught themselves to read by observing the letters on crates and newspapers, by watching children do lessons, by bartering whatever small favors they could offer in exchange for a few minutes of instruction. The hunger for knowledge on the plantation was constant and was met with extraordinary ingenuity. Every enslaved person who learned to read was making a revolutionary act. Every one of them was risking their life. Resistance was not exceptional on 18th century plantations. It was constant, and it took 1,000 forms. There was the obvious and desperate kind, the armed uprising, the escape into the woods and swamps, the flight north along whatever informal networks of help existed. There were also quieter forms of resistance that the plantation system never fully neutralized. Tools broke with suspicious frequency. Crops were harvested slowly. Animals fell ill at inconvenient times. Fires started in barns. Work that was done poorly enough to avoid punishment, but not so poorly as to invite it. This is called day-to-day resistance by historians, and it was a form of psychological warfare conducted by people with almost no power against a system with almost total power. It preserved, in however small a way, a sense of agency. It was the insistence that one's will was still one's own. The punishment system was the backbone of plantation control, and it was explicit, formalized, and almost never prosecuted. Enslavers had the legal right to physically punish their enslaved workers for virtually any reason or no reason, and the punishments that were applied ranged from reduced food rations to confinement to whipping to branding to mutilation to death. Whipping was the most common serious punishment, and it was administered in public in front of the entire enslaved community, because the purpose was not merely to punish the individual, but to terrorize the collective. Everyone watching was meant to understand what awaited them. The sounds of punishment were meant to follow everyone back to the fields. Overseers and drivers kept detailed records of punishments in some cases, records that survive in plantation archives and tell, in their bland administrative language, a story of industrialized violence. 10 lashes for absence, 25 lashes for talking back, 39 lashes, the biblical maximum intended to stop just short of death, for a variety of offenses that might include looking at a white person in the wrong way, or being suspected of reading, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. 39 lashes with a leather whip on a human back is not a punishment that leaves the body unchanged. It leaves scars. It leaves nerve damage. It leaves the kind of physical memory that never fully departs. The sexual violence on plantations was pervasive and almost entirely unpunished. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse sexual contact from an enslaver, and the law did not recognize rape of an enslaved person as a crime. The vulnerability of enslaved women was absolute, and it was exploited with a casualness that is among the most disturbing aspects of the entire system. Children born from these encounters occupied a grotesque legal position. The child followed the condition of the mother, which meant that an enslaved woman's child was always enslaved, regardless of the father's status. Enslaver men who fathered children with enslaved women sometimes sold those children. They sometimes freed them. They sometimes simply ignored their existence. The children lived with the knowledge of their origins, and with the weight of what that knowledge meant about the world they had been born into. The domestic workers in the great house lived in a different kind of proximity to power, and it was no less dangerous. Cooks, house servants, ladies' maids, butlers, and children's nurses worked inside the master's home, which meant they were visible to him at all times, available to his moods, expected to absorb his family's emotions without expressing their own. They were not permitted to show anger, grief, or fatigue. They were required to be present and invisible simultaneously. The performance demanded of house servants was an extreme form of the performance demanded of every enslaved person. The constant suppression of the self in the service of another's comfort. Psychologists who have studied the long-term effects of this kind of role performance have called it a form of sustained psychological trauma with effects that could persist across generations. And yet, watching, the proximity to the great house was also quietly a form of intelligence gathering. House servants heard conversations. They knew when letters arrived and who sent them. They knew the financial state of the plantation. They knew when the master was afraid. This information moved through the quarters in whispers. It was another form of resistance that the system of slavery could never entirely prevent, because the same access it demanded for service was also access to knowledge. There were men and women in the 18th century who looked at the plantation system and called it what it was: a moral catastrophe. The Quakers began formally opposing slavery in the 1690s, and by the mid-18th century, figures like John Woolman were traveling through the American colonies pleading with Quaker slaveholders to free their enslaved workers on the grounds of basic Christian conscience. Woolman's journal, published in 1774, is one of the most quietly devastating documents in American history, a record of a man traveling through a beautiful and terrible country, unable to look away from what it was doing to human souls, both the ones it enslaved and the ones doing the enslaving. The abolitionist argument was not primarily about economics, though abolitionists did make economic arguments. It was primarily about humanity. It was the simple and radical claim that the people on those plantations were fully human, fully deserving of the rights and dignities that their enslavers claimed for themselves. This argument was not considered self-evident at the time. It had to be argued, demonstrated, proven, and it had to be proven against the resistance of an economic system worth billions in modern dollars, and a social system that had organized the entire identity of the Southern ruling class around the concept of white supremacy. The enslaved people who escaped and told their stories were among the most powerful voices in this argument. Olaudah Equiano, who was enslaved as a child in West Africa, transported across the Atlantic on a slave ship, sold, resold, and eventually purchased his own freedom, published his autobiography in 1789, and it became one of the founding texts of the British abolitionist movement. His account of the Middle Passage, the transatlantic crossing in a ship's hold packed so tightly with human bodies that movement was nearly impossible, where the smell was so overwhelming that sailors preferred working on deck in any weather rather than descending below, where people died of disease and despair and were thrown overboard, where some chose to throw themselves overboard rather than continue, changed the conversation in ways that no pamphlet or sermon could match. He made people see. He made people understand that this was not abstraction. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery in Maryland in 1818, would do the same thing a generation later, with a rhetorical power and an intellectual force that stunned the audiences who heard him speak and could not quite believe that this man, this magnificent speaker with this devastating mind, had been legally considered someone's property a few years before. Douglass understood what his presence meant, and he used it with precision. He was the argument made flesh, and the argument was simple: you cannot justify what was done to me. Back on the plantation in the mid-18th century, a generation before Douglass, before Equiano's book, before the American Revolution, had introduced its thunderous contradictions into the national conversation about liberty. Life continued in its rhythms of labor and punishment and endurance. Children were born and sometimes sold away before they could speak. Old people died in the quarters and were buried in unmarked graves, their names preserved, if at all, only in the memory of those who loved them. Songs were sung in the darkness after the overseers had gone home. Food was cooked over small fires. Stories were told about home, about Africa, about the before time, the time that some of the oldest members of the community could still remember or had heard from those who came before them. These stories were a form of resistance too. They were the insistence that there was a world before this one, and that the people in it had been whole. Families developed intricate systems for maintaining connection across the distances imposed by sale and forced separation. An enslaved man who had been sold away from his family might, if he was fortunate and his new master permitted it, be allowed to visit on Sunday, the one day of the week when labor requirements were slightly loosened. He might walk 10 or 15 miles to spend a few hours with his wife and children, and then walk back in the dark. He did this because the alternative was to abandon hope entirely, and hope, however fragile and conditional, was the one thing that the plantation system, for all its systematic cruelty, could not entirely extinguish. Music and storytelling in the quarters were not merely entertainment. They were the maintenance of identity. They were the place where a person could be, for a few hours, something other than property. The songs told stories of biblical liberation and coded geographical information. They recorded the names of the dead. They expressed love and grief and anger in forms that were, technically, acceptable to the master because he heard only religion or nonsense, but that carried, for the people singing them, meanings layered with survival and resistance, and a profound theology of human dignity. The great house and the quarters existed in a relationship that was closer and more psychologically complex than almost any other relationship in American history. The planter's family ate food that enslaved hands had grown and cooked. They wore clothes that enslaved hands had sewn and laundered. Their children were nursed at the breasts of enslaved women and raised in the company of enslaved children. The intimate knowledge that enslaved people held of the great house and its inhabitants was unparalleled, and it ran in only one direction. The enslaved people knew everything about the family they served, and the family permitted themselves to know almost nothing real about the people they owned. This was not ignorance. It was a deliberate choice, because full knowledge would have made the whole enterprise impossible to sustain. The contradiction at the heart of the American experiment has no cleaner statement than the fact that Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal and are endowed with unalienable rights, including liberty, owned over 600 human beings over the course of his lifetime and freed fewer than 10 of them. He knew what he was doing. His private writings make it clear that he understood the moral horror of slavery. He wrote about it as a wolf he held by the ears, unable to let go, afraid of what would happen if he did. The fear that animated his paralysis was economic and political and personal, but it was also something more visceral, the fear of what justice would look like if it actually arrived. That fear tells you something about what everyone involved knew, at whatever depth they were willing to look, about what had been done. The end of the 18th century brought significant change to the rhetoric around slavery without bringing significant change to the reality of it. The American Revolution's language of liberty created a powerful ideological tension that abolitionists would exploit for the next 8 decades. Some northern states began the gradual process of abolition. The international slave trade was officially prohibited by the United States in 1808, though the domestic trade in enslaved people continued and actually expanded dramatically. The cotton gin, invented in 1793, made cotton cultivation vastly more profitable and created a new and voracious demand for enslaved labor in the Deep South. The number of enslaved people in the United States actually increased in the decades following the Revolution. The rhetoric of liberty and the reality of slavery grew further and further apart, and the tension between them accumulated, like pressure beneath a fault line, for 60 more years. In the quarters, through all of this, life continued. Children grew up and had children of their own. Some of those children were sold away. Some managed to maintain some fragment of family across the distances imposed by the system. Some escaped. A small number purchased their own freedom or were freed by their enslavers. The vast majority lived and died in slavery, their names recorded in ledgers, not as people but as assets. Their stories passed down in oral tradition, or not passed down at all, their graves unmarked, their contributions to the country that was being built around them unacknowledged, their humanity denied by law and custom, and a willful blindness that served the comfort of the powerful. But they were there. They built the roads and the buildings and the fields that made the American economy possible. They invented and adapted and created under conditions that were designed to prevent them from doing any of those things. They maintained families and communities and cultures against systematic efforts to destroy them. They sang, they prayed, they told stories. They remembered where they came from. They imagined a future different from their present. They survived. There is a woman whose name we do not know who stood in a field in Virginia in the summer of 1743 and felt the sun on her face between rows of tobacco and thought something. We do not know what she thought. We do not have her diary or her letters because she was not permitted to write and would not have been permitted to keep anything she wrote if she had. We do not know if she was born in Africa or in the colonies. We do not know if she had children or had lost them. We do not know if she had a husband or had watched him sold away. We know only that she was there, that she was a human being in the fullest sense of that phrase, and that the system that surrounded her did not believe that, and that she lived her entire life inside the grinding machinery of that disbelief. She is the reason this history matters. Not the planters, not the politics, not the economics, though all of those things matter too. She is the reason, the unnamed woman in the field, the child who walked to work before dawn, the old man who died in the quarters and was buried without a marker, the mother who sang her children to sleep in a language that was slowly being taken from her. They are the center of this history. They are the weight it carries. Understanding what life was really like on an 18th century slave plantation is not an academic exercise. It is a moral one. It is the work of acknowledging what was done and who did it and who endured it. It is the necessary corrective to a history that spent too long softening the edges of this story or leaving it in the margins where it could be overlooked. The people who lived through this were not peripheral. They were not background. They were at the center of American life, and they remain at the center of American consequence, because the society we live in today was built, in significant part, by their labor and their suffering and their astonishing, unextinguishable humanity. The songs they sang in the quarters are still being sung, in new forms, in new voices, but carrying the same refusal to be silenced. The food they cooked is still on American tables. The faith they practiced, stripped of the version that was meant to control them and rebuilt into something that insisted on their own liberation, became one of the great moral forces in American history. The families they built against every obstacle the system could throw at them, extended forward in time into families that are alive today, families who carry the memory of this history in their blood and their stories even when the specific names and dates have been lost. History is not only about the past, it is about what the past made and what we owe to the people who made it possible for us to be here. The enslaved people of the 18th century did not consent to building this country. They built it anyway, under compulsion and terror and loss that most of us will never be able to fully imagine. The least we can do is look at it clearly. The least we can do is say their names, even the ones we have lost, even the ones that were never recorded. Even the woman in the Virginia tobacco field in 1743, whose name we will never know, we can say, you were here, you were real, you mattered. What was done to you was wrong, and you survived it with a grace and a courage and a creativity that the people who did it to you did not deserve and could not destroy. That is the history. That is what life was really like, and it does not belong in the past. It belongs in our understanding of ourselves, in our ongoing reckoning with who we are and what we owe to each other. It belongs in conversations like this one, where we sit with the discomfort and refuse to look away, because the people whose lives we have just walked through did not have the option of looking away. They lived it every day in full. If this history moved you, if it stayed with you, if it made you see something differently, then please subscribe to this channel and share this documentary with someone who needs to hear it. History told honestly is one of the most radical things we can do. Come back for more stories like this one, because there are so many more lives worth understanding and so many more truths worth telling.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping Through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. If I never met you, maybe I would know just how to heal, but now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would, but pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger, now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone